Paul Heyman's betrayal of Roman Reigns wasn't the result of a sudden impulse or an emotional breakdown in the face of mounting tension. It was a masterclass in long-term strategy, timed precision, and survival instinct wrapped within the veil of loyalty that Heyman has so consistently weaponized throughout his career. To understand why he turned on the tribal chief, one must first understand the layers of pressure, disillusionment, and foreboding Heyman had been quietly digesting ever since the inception of the Bloodline storyline. This wasn't a betrayal sparked by conflict alone. It was a rebellion against stagnation, against the misuse of a dynasty he once believed in, and it started long before the final Raw before WrestleMania. For years, Paul Heyman played the role of loyal consigliere, Roman's advocate, his shield and his brain. He was the whisper in his ear and the translator of Roman's rage. But slowly, over time, the authority Roman wielded morphed from powerful to paranoid. The man who once sat at the head of the table grew erratic, increasingly self-interested, and visibly hostile toward dissent. Every time Jey Uso questioned his motives, Roman met it with psychological warfare. Every time Sami Zayn showed heart, Roman crushed it. But the way Roman treated Paul, especially in the last year, carried a bitterness that Heyman couldn't overlook. What had begun as mutual dominance transformed into dictatorial ego, and somewhere along the way, Roman forgot that even a wise man needs to feel respected. Heyman, ever the calculating manipulator, observed the fissures before they were visible to most. He watched as Jimmy Uso blindly fell back into Roman's grip only to be chewed up and discarded. He watched Solo Sikoa become more of a blunt object than a brother, following orders but clearly straining under the yoke of Roman's narcissism. And perhaps most importantly, he saw Jey's emancipation as not just a personal triumph, but a symbolic warning. Roman's empire was crumbling from within, and its foundation, fear, was no longer sustainable. Fear fades. Loyalty built on fear dies. Heyman, whose career has been rooted in outlasting regimes and surviving implosions, knew he had to realign himself before the collapse buried him too. CM Punk's return wasn't just a monumental pop, it was the reappearance of someone Heyman once viewed as a son. While that connection had grown dusty, the emotional tether never quite snapped. Heyman managed Punk at his peak, helped mold his infamous 434-day reign, and watched him walk away from the company with a bitter taste in his mouth. But Punk's second coming carried a different energy, wiser, more reflective, still rebellious, but no longer self-destructive. To Heyman, that represented a rebirth worth betting on. He didn't just see a competitor, he saw a potential successor to the kind of reign Roman once carried. And unlike Roman, Punk still respected the voices behind the throne. Then there was Seth Rollins, the man who broke away from the Shield and carved his own unpredictable path. The one Roman never quite trusted, the one always seen as an outsider to the Bloodline power structure. Yet Seth persisted, evolved, and eventually found purpose not through dominance, but through showmanship and integrity. In Heyman's eyes, Seth didn't need a leash, he needed an ally, and that difference meant everything. As WrestleMania 41 drew closer, the tension within the triple threat grew more volatile. Roman, visibly shaken by the prospect of having to defend his throne against two of his most dangerous rivals, began to spiral. Instead of leading with the composed menace that once defined him, he became desperate. The cracks weren't just emotional, they were physical. His aggression towards CM Punk wasn't strategic, it was reckless. His disdain for Seth Rollins wasn't tactical, it was personal, and Heyman stood beside him watching the tribal chief unravel before his very eyes. The final straw wasn't a single moment, but rather a series of small humiliations. Roman barking at Heyman in private, questioning his loyalty in front of others, and treating him like a liability rather than a confidant. Reigns no longer saw Heyman as a partner in warfare, he saw him as baggage. That miscalculation cost him dearly, because in dismissing Heyman's value, Roman inadvertently made himself vulnerable to the very kind of betrayal he had always feared. When Reigns shoved Heyman on the final Raw before WrestleMania, it wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was a statement, a physical manifestation of the disrespect that had been building for months. That shove crystallized Heyman's choice. In front of millions, Roman told the world that Paul Heyman was disposable, and Heyman, a master of survival, chose to side with those who valued his presence instead of those who weaponized his silence. What made Heyman's betrayal so poetic wasn't just the timing, but the legacy behind it. This wasn't his first betrayal. He turned on Brock Lesnar at the height of Lesnar's power, seeing the writing on the wall before anyone else did. But with Roman, it was more intimate. It felt like a father letting go of a son who had lost his way. And in a perverse way, it was Heyman's final gift to Reigns, cutting him loose before the business tore him apart. What made it even more impactful was the presence of CM Punk and Seth Rollins. Heyman didn't have to speak to make his intentions clear. clear. Aligning himself with Punk and Rollins in that moment was a full circle return to everything Roman once tried to suppress: independence, unpredictability, and revolution. He sided with the embodiment of anti-authority against the very authority figure he helped create. The betrayal wasn't loud, but it was devastating. And in typical Heyman fashion, it was about more than drama. It was about legacy. Heyman didn't want to be remembered as the sycophant who rode Roman's wave until it drowned. He wanted to be remembered as the architect of change, the man who, when history demanded it, pulled the plug on a decaying dynasty. It wasn't revenge, it was evolution. It was Heyman doing what he's always done, moving before the ground collapses beneath him. There's also an argument to be made that Heyman never truly trusted Roman's endgame. Deep down, he likely always knew that Roman saw himself as above everyone, including Heyman, and as much as Paul masqueraded in the role of the subservient servant, he never tolerated being seen as less than essential. Roman forgot that. He turned Heyman into a background character in his own war, and no one puts Paul Heyman in the background and survives. The betrayal also allowed WWE's narrative landscape to shift into new territory. By pulling Heyman from Roman's corner, it changed the tribal warfare from a family conflict into a legacy war. The battle at WrestleMania was no longer about dominance. It was about ideology. It became a fight between those who clung to power and those who dared to dismantle it. Heyman, perhaps more than anyone, knew how to transition from one empire to the next. What makes this moment even more explosive is how it forces Solo Sikoa, Jimmy Uso, and the rest of the Bloodline to choose. The wise man wasn't just Roman's mouthpiece, he was the stabilizer, the translator of vision into execution. Without him, Roman is exposed. And if Roman is exposed, the bloodline is no longer sacred, it's fractured. And fractured kingdoms don't survive wars, they implode from within. There's also the strategic brilliance of Heyman's move. Aligning himself with CM Punk, who is already beloved by the fans and seen as the last bastion of real rebellion in WWE, is a genius PR play. Pair that with the unpredictable volatility of Seth Rollins, and Heyman now has a foothold on both chaos and order. Roman, in contrast, has nothing left but control, and control, when challenged, turns into desperation. The betrayal sent shockwaves beyond WWE television. It created an atmosphere of unpredictability heading into WrestleMania, one where even longtime fans who thought they had seen every twist found themselves stunned. The moment Paul Heyman left Roman's side, it retroactively redefined the entire Bloodline story. It wasn't just Roman's descent, it was Heyman's quiet uprising. A master of deception, Heyman had always walked the line between loyalty and ambition. This time, he walked away from the line altogether. What makes this fallout artful is the restraint. WWE could have had Heyman turn on Roman in an explosive fashion long ago. A chair shot, a public dressing down, even an alliance with a rival like Cody or Punk. But they waited. They allowed Heyman's betrayal, or Roman's, depending on your perspective, to be emotional, gradual, and simmering. This wasn't about shock value. This was about creating the kind of deep-rooted drama that blurs the lines between kayfabe and real-life trust. Because when Heyman finally hesitated during the April 14th Raw and Roman shoved him, it wasn't the shove that mattered. It was Heyman's expression, not anger, not fear, but sorrow. That's the genius of this program. Roman Reigns is not a villain in a traditional sense. He's a man who demanded loyalty in a world where loyalty is currency, but he spent it recklessly. Heyman, always loyal to power, began to see that Roman's strength was no longer absolute. The psychological warfare between them wasn't played out in loud promos or backstage brawls. It happened in glances, in silences, in who stood closer to the camera. Their relationship became a battlefield of posture and presence, where control meant everything. And now, with WrestleMania looming, that battlefield has erupted into outright chaos. When Rollins curb-stomped Reigns at the end of Raw, it was significant, but even more significant was the moment before, when Roman confronted Heyman. Reigns was never the type to lash out impulsively. His aggression was always measured, justified. But now, his push against Heyman wasn't about dominance. It was about betrayal. Not Heyman's betrayal of Roman, but Roman's betrayal of the very image he built. The tribal chief was supposed to be unbreakable, but his panic, his emotional outburst, and his inability to keep Heyman fully under his influence marked the beginning of the end. In the end, Heyman's betrayal wasn't just about Roman's fall. It was about reminding the world that no one, not even the tribal chief, is untouchable. Every king eventually bleeds. And Paul Heyman, perhaps the greatest manipulator in wrestling history, made sure the blade was sharp, the timing perfect, and the audience captivated. Roman Reigns built a table, sat at the head of it, and forgot who set the plates. Paul Heyman didn't. And when the table collapsed, it was Heyman's silence that echoed louder than any sword.